chat.
But we might as well get started. Hi, Beth.
Hi, it's great to see you, Mark.
Always good to chat with you, Beth. What a wild 20, not even 24 hours, gosh, a wild 15 hours. Let's introduce ourselves. My name is Mark Leon Goldberg. I'm the host of this very podcast, Global Dispatches. I do these live streams, fairly frequently, but publish 2 episodes a week every week on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. And Beth, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Beth Dickinson. I'm the Deputy Director for Latin America at International Crisis Group. It's a field-based organization focused on conflict prevention and analysis. I'm based in Bogota, in Colombia.
And you are in Bogota at the moment. I'm in world headquarters in Denver, Colorado. And I have so many questions for you, Beth. But just to kick off, I want to have you just situate listeners and viewers of where we are right now. Can you just explain as best we know, and we're speaking at about 2:00 Eastern on Saturday, January 3rd, about what happened overnight in Venezuela?
So what we know is that around just before 2:00 in the morning local time in Venezuela, there was essentially an extraction team sent from the United States into Venezuela to apprehend Nicolás Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores. That team had been training for some time, we understand, in the vicinity, including in a full replica of the Maduro compound where he was staying. So this is a highly planned operation, according to what officials have said in press conference. And that information about where his whereabouts was apparently obtained through an asset that the CIA had turned in recent months. So this force entered to secure the perimeter. They were able to capture Maduro and his wife, and then were later able to do the extraction. We understand there were about 150 planes involved in the operation, and that although there was some damage to one helicopter and also one plane, everyone was able to sort of get out from the American side. There do appear to be a number of casualties on the Venezuelan side, but that is quite unclear at the moment. Simultaneous to that, we had about 90 minutes of pretty significant airstrikes on targets throughout Caracas. Caracas, by the way, for reference, for those who haven't been there, is a valley. It's essentially, it's sort of in a bowl. And so these airstrikes sort of echoed throughout the entire city, and you can imagine sort of what the theatrical effect and really, I think, terrifying for many Venezuelans who, we started to get calls 2-3 in the morning with folks really just very scared about what was happening. So those airstrikes took place for about 90 minutes. They do seem to have then stopped. And now we're in a state of uncertainty. A lot of Venezuelans staying home, sheltering in place, sort of waiting to hear what could be next.
Do we know much about the scale of damage to Venezuelan infrastructure? Was it mostly military targets that were hit and bombed?
There were a significant number of military targets, including the most significant base that's near Caracas. There was an airport, a port. But to the extent of the damage, we really just don't know at this point. We also don't know what civilian casualties might have been involved in that. And I think, here, sort of to preview where we might go in this conversation, this is the critical question, I think, at the moment, is who now will have the ability and the capacity to take control of Venezuela's critical infrastructure. And here, I'm not talking about seizing oil rigs. I'm talking about seizing electricity, taking control of the services, water, electricity, that are keeping Venezuela functioning and keeping many civilians in a survival mode.
So we will get there for sure. That's like the bulk of the conversation I want to have with you later on is, what inflection points, what moments, what events, what statements you're looking towards that will suggest to you how events might unfold in Venezuela. But before we get there, again, just kind of situate us where we are right now. Maduro and his wife are apparently en route somehow to New York, where they will be charged with various crimes under an indictment that was issued about 5 years ago. And of course, this raises a big question of who's running Venezuela. Then about an hour or so ago, the Trump administration, Donald Trump himself, concluded a press conference answering some of those questions. Can you just walk viewers and listeners through what we learned from that press conference?
Well, I think the first thing to say, and something that's, I think, actually really important to sort of a starting point for where we go from here, is that despite the fact that Maduro and his wife were removed, it appears that the rest of the regime remains essentially intact. And this is a regime that is quite entrenched, and many of the ministers and officials who are still on the ground in Venezuela have been those who have been involved in repression and some of the worst violations. So I think there's a lot of questions about sort of how this proceeds while they are still there. Then we had this press conference from Trump himself in which he stated, "We will run the country until there is the possibility of a transition." This really is a befuddling statement. Who is we? There, at the moment, are not U.S. troops on the ground that we are aware of. How you could control a country of this size and complexity without a presence is truly, it's a mystery to me what they seem to be implying here. There does seem to be a deal, some sort of arrangement that has been made with the former vice president, Delcy Rodriguez, who has now apparently been sworn into office as president. During that same press conference, it was said that she will do what she is told from the United States, in a near quote from the president. I think this raises a lot of questions because, as you know, and we know from many experiences of U.S. military intervention abroad, a regime is a complex animal. It is an organism, and it is never unified. And removing one person from that regime certainly does not guarantee that there will be a transition, and much less that it could be a peaceful transition. This is a regime with divisions inside of it. We're very concerned about the possibility of destabilization. For example, splits within the military, factions who may remain loyal to Chavismo, the movement from which Maduro comes, other parts that might support a transition. This is really a Pandora's box of possibilities in terms of who might actually take de facto control of day-to-day life in Venezuela.
Yeah, I mean, it seems it was odd, at least to me, that the administration in that press conference suggested that Maduro's vice president, Dulce Rodriguez, is now the person in charge of the country, but doing so at the behest and whims of the Trump administration. Like, how do you make sense of that?
I think it doesn't make a lot of sense at this moment. And I think we have to see what that arrangement really looks like. And we also, frankly, have to see how much control Delcy Rodriguez maintains over the apparatus of the Venezuelan state. One would assume that some of that can keep functioning. But here's the thing about governance in this situation. The coherence, particularly of the security forces, but also much of the bureaucracy under Maduro, was maintained intact through the flow of patronage. So the redistribution of cash from oil, from selling gold, from the export of minerals, from trafficking, all of that was passed up and down through the length of the system. And I think it's a really important question to ask: what happens if and when that money stops flowing? And then, will the cohesion that has been a feature of the military, certainly so far, will that continue to be the case?
That's just, I think, an important point to emphasize because, I'm no expert, but I've interviewed a lot of experts like you on this situation, and they all point to the patronage networks that Maduro used to sustain his grip on power. They'd say he's perfectly happy to immiserate his population in order to pay off and sustain his grip on power by, spreading the wealth to his inner circle. And then, what happens if those networks, that wealth is cut off is, a critical question.
And interestingly, the system that you just described is actually precisely what the U.S. has called Cartel de los Soles, the cartel of the suns. The cartel of the suns is not a sort of structured criminal organization the way we might think of a cartel normally. It's an expression used to describe precisely that system in which military officials, government officials have been paid off for many years by traffickers, by illegal miners, to move things through the country. And again, that has been a very significant source of liquidity for the government. And I think a major question now is does that continue? Does it stop? Who gets this income? And I think here, let's also mention, of course, there's been a lot of emphasis on Venezuela's oil reserves, the
Yeah.
largest proven oil reserves in the world. But that's not all. Venezuela is also home to some of the most lucrative gold mines in South America, as well as other minerals, including rare earth minerals, that are now being tapped in the south of the country, largely under the auspices of criminal and armed groups that have control de facto over those areas.
So I'm glad you brought up oil because this was a point emphasized by President Trump himself in that press conference. And he seemed to lean into the idea that the US just did regime change for oil. Like, what do you make of that?
I think there have been a lot of motivations from within the White House that we can piece together here from afar. And I think that all of those competing agendas all landed on this one action and operation, but for very different reasons. It is very well possible that for Trump, the oil is the question that was determinant. I think for Marco Rubio, someone who's very close to the Venezuelan opposition, who has been essentially built his career on targeting and punishing, and then in this case deposing leftist governments in Latin America. In this case, and here let's be very clear: Maduro lost elections in 2024 and refused to concede power. So he is far from a sort of legitimate leader. But I think Rubio's agenda has been to forcibly remove him for some time, for those political reasons and for his own, I think, his ambitions personally. I think there are other agendas in the White House as well. There's the immigration and deportation agenda, for which the situation in Venezuela is critical. If Venezuela appears to have been stabilized or taken by the United States, then there is no excuse, quote unquote, for Venezuelans to stay in the United States. And this sort of accelerates the narrative that mass deportations are it's the moment, that these are relevant.
So I wanted to ask you about the status now of the opposition leader, Machado, who, remarkably in that press conference, Donald Trump seemed to dismiss her and sideline her, saying that she doesn't have much support within Venezuela, despite the fact that her opposition movement very clearly, legitimately won the 2024 elections, and Maduro, refused to cede power. It's interesting. If you ask Machado supporters, about regime change in Venezuela, they'll say there was regime change, a year and a half ago when we won the elections. Maduro just didn't step aside. Yet, here we have seemingly someone who might have some democratic legitimacy who is apparently being sidelined.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, again, this was another sort of very confusing piece of the press conference that was laid out. Specifically because just minutes really before that press conference began, Maria Corina Machado put out a statement saying that her movement would be announcing next steps imminently in a matter of hours. So there seems to be a dissonance here, and it could have to do with agendas. And very clearly, when everyone agrees on the same objective, but then for different reasons, in the medium term, their coherence starts to split. And so this may be indeed the very beginning of that.
So obviously, these are very fast moving events. I won't ask you to predict what will happen tomorrow, let alone next week, let alone a few months down the road. But I am interested in getting your take, your analysis on, what specifically you're looking at that will suggest to you how events may unfold in the coming, days and weeks.
I think the basic security situation on the ground is really critical. So we need to watch in the coming days if shops are open, if Venezuelans are moving out on the streets safely. At the moment, what we understand is that many people are sheltering in place. Many stores are closed. So there is a potential, first of all, for an immediate term shortage of goods. As the needing to resupply and an inability to do that on the part of residents. I think secondly, we need to look at the control of critical infrastructure. Who's controlling the electricity and the water grid, and making sure that these services continue to operate. Those are sort of the basic questions that I think have been we've learned from previous U.S. military action are critical in the first hours after something like this. Then we need to hear more about the plan for a transition. And if that plan is for the U.S. to essentially govern through the newly inaugurated former Vice President Delcy Rodriguez. We need details on what that means, what it looks like, what guarantees are in place for Venezuelans, if there will be plans for elections going forward. That's all down the road. But I think in the immediate term, again, it's stability, it's control of infrastructure, and it's knowing what the plan is.
Mhm.
That's in Caracas. I think in the rest of Venezuela, we have to be very wary that this is a completely different ballgame. In places like southern Venezuela, where there is significant competition to control natural resources, the coming days could be fraught with criminal expansion, advantageous attempts to take advantage of the disorder, of the confusion. We also have very significant presence of a particular group in Venezuela called the ELN. That is a Colombian guerrilla organization, actually, that was founded in the 1960s, but today has as many as half of its fighters in Venezuela, was allied with the Maduro government and had vowed to come to its defense. What do? Their expertise really is in high-profile terrorist-style attacks, bombings, for example, the use of armed drones. And I think these are all sort of risk factors floating in the context that we need to be aware of and watching out for in the coming days.
So, I mean, you've alluded to this a couple of times, but Beth, you and I, got our start in similar journalism circles in the early 2000s in the wake of the US invasion and occupation of Iraq. And, the days are early right now. Really, this has all happened over the last, few hours, but I can't help but see some striking similarities unfolding right now, even in terms of like the language used by the administration, saying, for example, that the oil is going to like pay for it all, that this won't cost the United States a thing. And then this seeming, I don't know, hubris or arrogance that's being projected by the administration right now that, in fact, they can run Venezuela one way or another. And of course, we all know how, Iraq went.
There are striking parallels, and I've had to sort of pinch myself quite a bit, not just today, but in recent weeks about some of these assertions. For example, that what you mentioned, that the oil will pay for it. The same thing was said about Libya during the Arab Spring, when there was a decision to intervene and remove Gaddafi in that moment. I think one of the lessons that we've all learned from the past 2 decades is, first of all, that governance is complicated. And, particularly in situations of chaos, or of uncertainty, there are always unknown unknowns, as the famous Iraq term goes. We don't know if there are fissures within the military that are currently planning to take control of this or that. We don't know what armed and criminal groups are doing throughout the country and how they're planning to take advantage of this situation, because they will take advantage of it in the way that they deem to be appropriate to their interests. And we don't know, frankly, how citizens are going to react. And I think, all of these unknown unknowns are lessons we should have learned. It's very clear that the level of planning for an operation was very calibrated to the smallest detail, and the plans for the post-operational period, so from here onward, are really at a draft stage, I would say, at best.
And again, going back to the Iraq analogy and also what you said earlier, I mean, it seems to me that one of the key kind of inflection points will unfold over the next 24, 48 hours is, in Caracas itself, like, will there be looting? Will services continue? Will trash get picked up? Will schools open? Will hospitals function? All of the things that we saw fall apart really rapidly after the fall of Baghdad, which predicated this years long occupation by American forces. So, again, coming back to that Iraq analogy and also what you said earlier, I mean, I guess I'm going to be watching to see if if there's looting and rioting on the streets in Caracas.
No, I think exactly. And this is why it's so important to look at the control of those basic services. Will municipality workers show up to their offices to, if they don't know if they'll be paid, who they work for, what the plan is? Will the trash be picked up? As you said, I think all of those things are a good indicator of how much of a grip we have on this situation, and really how out of control this could spin and how quickly.
So I know you're speaking. Actually, let me ask one more question about the periphery, about the rest of the countries. You've
Sure.
alluded a few times now to criminal armed groups that will certainly seek to exploit this situation. Like, how violent might that get, or how might they seek to exploit what they can through violence, and who might that violence be targeted against?
Sure. So I think, the capacity for violence by the groups that we're talking about is very significant. In the areas that they already control, for example, in mining communities in southern Venezuela, we know about forced coercion, entrapment of the population, forced labor, use of children, instrumentalization of women and girls, violent clashes between criminal groups over the control of certain mines. And I think another factor here is that, again, because this system was very disparate, the regime was held together again by, I'll use the same expression, a web of patronage. There was quite a degree of decentralization. So there are significant areas that were essentially under the de facto control of one military commander or one governor, who was sort of had access to a mine or a resource to use that to finance their own existence, and sort of facilitate part of being part of this system. What will happen to those individuals who have been empowered under the Maduro government, who have access to resources, who have links or at least the ability to speak with armed and criminal groups? What will their reaction be in terms of the consolidation of these resources? And you mentioned also, sorry, you asked a question about who this could possibly be against. I think in a lot of certainly in mining areas, we're talking about indigenous communities who have very little recourse in terms of pushing back. Mining areas are some of the most desperate places I think you can imagine. Malaria, which was eradicated from Venezuela. Venezuela is actually the first country to eradicate Venezuela in South America. Came back to the country about 15 years ago because of the devastating conditions in mining areas and the very poor level of protocol and just basics living conditions for miners. So all of that is I think what we have at the moment, and in a situation of uncertainty only stands to be exacerbated, unfortunately.
So you're speaking to me from Bogota, and Colombia is the country that most proximately, I think, is impacted by instability in Venezuela. What's the conversation in Bogota right now? How are both citizens and officials kind of bracing for what may befall Colombia because of what's just happened in Venezuela?
Well, so I think that Colombia has been preparing for some months for a scenario of military action in Venezuela, including a possible destabilizing situation in terms of governance. And so we saw that those plans were essentially activated this morning. At 3 a.m., there was a meeting of Colombia's National Security Council. They decided to deploy more troops to the border. It's a very long, more than 2,000-kilometer long border, very porous. So the troops were deployed there. They certainly will not be able to put an iron lock on that space. But the other thing that I think is really demonstrative of what the region is concerned about is the humanitarian situation. Colombia already preparing for waves of migrants or refugees should they choose to flee any situation of violence or lack of resources inside Venezuela. I think that's sort of the practical, immediate implications. More broadly for the region, I think this action and the words of the U.S. president in his press conference are chilling for the region, because the message is essentially get on board or you could face being deposed. That is a level of sort of coercive power that the U.S. has not sought to employ in the region in quite a while, and brings back, I think, in Latin America, a number of very unfortunate past memories of U.S. policy.
Lastly, is there a point you wanted to make, or a question I didn't ask that you think would be helpful to viewers and listeners of this show, particularly people like in the foreign policy community?
I think that there's a lot of risks going forward, and I think this could really lead to a reconfiguration of relations in the region between the U.S. and states of South and Latin America, South America and the Caribbean. in terms of their relationship with Washington, how they respond to that coercive message. I do also think that there is a geopolitical component here that should not be ignored. The primary consumers and purchasers of Venezuelan oil up to this point were China. Of course, the tankers that were apprehended, one of them, which ran away from U.S. forces, essentially claimed to be part of the Russian fleet in order to gain protection. There are geopolitical interests in this region that now have been touched and affected and could have ripple effects, I think, in other conflicts, whether that's Ukraine, whether that's in broader, China's broader influence in the Western Hemisphere. All of that is at play now. And I think it needs to be on our radar because, again, it will be a factor in whether the U.S. is able to consolidate any peaceful transition in Venezuela.
That's interesting. I mean, I could imagine that the Chinese in particular would want to do what they can to protect their interests in this situation. And accordingly, their interests might not align with American interests, and they frankly probably don't when it comes to oil. And so you might have lots of external kind of players, powerful external players like China trying to steer events on the ground as well, as opposed to just, the United States is the only key powerful player trying to steer events.
Exactly right. And I think we have to see this in its correct dimension because I don't think that China has any interest or capacity in sort of intervening militarily to support, the government in Venezuela. I don't expect any sort of outside military action from other geopolitical powers, but trying to shift the results of a transition, yes. Trying to influence commercial outcomes, absolutely. And certainly this is a big interest in play now. Again, Venezuela, world's largest proven oil reserves. If they are under the control of the United States, that would be a monumental shift in sort of resource power going forward.
Well, Beth, as always, thank you so much for speaking with me. I love having you on the show. I know it's been a very, very busy day for you. So thank you so much on behalf of my audience for sharing a little of your time and expertise with me today. Thank you.
Thanks to you, Mark. It's always a joy. See you soon.
Bye.
Bye.